The conference room was built to make people feel small. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls wrapped around it, framing the city like a possession instead of a place. The long obsidian table reflected the skyline in a smooth, dark sheen. Leather chairs were spaced just far enough apart to discourage whispering. Bottles of imported water stood beside engraved nameplates like miniature trophies. The only sound was the soft tap of fingers on tablets and the low hum of the climate system keeping the air precisely, expensively cool. At the far end of the table, where the glass met the wall, a woman sat in a simple gray cardigan that did not match the room at all. Her cardigan had been mended once at the cuff, the stitching tiny and careful. A leather folder lay open in front of her, its edges rounded from long use. Inside, pages were filled with precise handwriting, no printed slides, no color-coded tabs, just lines of ink and orderly notes. A faded photograph of a younger man and a little boy peeked from the corner of one page. Her hands, resting on the folder, were still for a moment. Then she lifted them, and they began to speak. Her fingers shaped meaning in the air, movements exact and unhurried. Her eyes flicked across faces at the table, reading lips, catching fragments of sound. Allocation, timeline, strategic, risk. She paused between signed sentences, leaving space where someone could step in, could interpret, could bridge the gap between her language and theirs. No one did. At the head of the table, the chairperson tapped a pen against a digital pad and smiled a tight, professional smile. "We'll need to keep comments brief," they said. "We're a little behind schedule." The woman at the end did not stop. She signed again, slower, as if clarity might compensate for the room's lack of effort. Her hand flattened over the agenda item on the printed sheet beside her. Foundation Accessibility Initiative, Funding Review. She pointed to the line. Then she pointed to herself. The chairperson blinked once, impatiently. "I understand you have prepared notes," they said, their voice smooth enough to coat the edges of impatience. "But without interpretation present, it will be difficult for us to incorporate your perspective in a way that's useful for everyone." A man halfway down the table glanced at a colleague and lifted an eyebrow. Someone near the windows tried to hide a smirk behind their coffee cup. Another person, younger, with a name badge that marked them as staff, shifted their weight and stared at the polished table surface. At the back wall, near the glass, a junior assistant raised her phone just enough that the camera lens cleared her notepad. The recording light stayed off, but the screen showed the room, faces half-turned, the woman at the end signing into a silence that felt deliberate. 2 seats away from the chairperson sat the billionaire. He wore a dark suit that deliberately avoided showing off. Nothing glittered except the watch he rarely glanced at. Unlike the others, no nameplate announced him. No one in the room needed a reminder. His companies underwrote half the initiatives on the agenda. His name appeared in financial headlines, so often it might as well have been a market indicator. He watched the scene with an unsettling stillness. His gaze moved from his mother's hands to the chairperson's face, to the muttered exchange on the left side of the table, to the assistant trying to pretend she wasn't filming. His expression was unreadable. No frown, no smile, no obvious anger. If anything, he looked like someone cataloging details. His mother signed again. She tapped her folder, opened it carefully, and lifted one page. The top corner bore date. She pointed to it sharply, then pointed at the same date printed on the agenda projected on the wall. The chairperson's smile thinned. "I think there may be some confusion about the format today," they said with studied patience. "We're not scheduling individual testimony. This is a strategic review. If you'd like to submit written comments, the secretary will." The woman signed, emphatically now. No flailing, no panic, just firm, precise motion, the kind that carried the weight of someone used to fighting to be understood. Her fingers described a previous meeting, a promise, a commitment that this session would include lived experience from those affected by the Foundation's accessibility policies. The meaning of it all hovered in the air, untranslate. The chairperson cleared their throat. "We simply don't have time to improvise process," they said. "We have an agenda to get through. I'm sure you understand." She understood all too well. It was the room that didn't. Her eyes shimmered, but she straightened her spine, laying both hands flat on the folder for a heartbeat. When she lifted them again, her movements were slower, deliberate. She signed that she wasn't confused. She signed that she had prepared. She signed that what they were discussing on paper affected real people outside this shimmering glass box. Half the attendees looked at their tablets instead of her. The billionaire remained motionless, fingers steepled loosely in front of him. The only betrayal of feeling was a small tension at the angle of his jaw. The chairperson tapped a control on their tablet. The wall display changed. A digital timer appeared beneath the agenda. 3 minutes remaining on this item, they announced. Let's stay focused. The numbers on the screen began to count down in red. 2:59. The room relaxed as if the timer were a rescue. The woman at the end inhaled, just enough for the rise of her chest to be visible. She glanced at the timer and started to sign more quickly. Not frantic, just adjusted for the reduced space the room had allocated to her existence. She pointed to 3 dates on her notes. She signed the names of projects that had been publicly announced with photos and press releases, then quietly delayed. She signed about grants meant for accessibility that had been diverted. She signed about employees who had requested simple accommodations, captioning, interpreters, adjusted schedules, and being told it wasn't cost-effective. The chairperson spoke over her moving hands. We can't proceed without clarity, they said. Without clear, verbal input, it's difficult to understand the specifics. Let's not get bogged down. The word clarity landed like a little insult wrapped in concern. Someone whispered, the accommodations should have been sorted out beforehand, and another person nodded, the blame floating conveniently toward the woman at the end of the table instead of the institution hosting the meeting. Outside the glass, a security supervisor slowed his steps, drawn by the subtle tension. He folded his arms and watched through the wall. 2:03. The billionaire's eyes tracked each person who spoke and, more importantly, each one who didn't. His mother's hand shaped another sentence. She pointed at the glass, at the city beyond, at the agenda on the wall. She signed that accessibility wasn't a side issue. It was the condition for the legitimacy of everything else they were doing. No one voiced that for her. The chairperson managed a pained smile. I'm going to have to ask you to yield the floor, they said. We have policies. We can't just. The door at the far side of the room opened. It didn't slam or draw attention to itself. The latch clicked softly, and the hinges glided. An older black woman stepped inside, pausing just past the threshold. Her hair was silver and coiled neatly back. She wore a dark coat over a simple dress and shoes made for walking, not impressing. A canvas tote hung from her shoulder, the fabric worn but sturdy. Her eyes scanned the room once. The chairperson at the head, the timer on the wall, the billionaire watching, the woman at the end signing into air that refused to carry her meaning. She took all of it in without haste. The chairperson's smile cooled by a few degrees. Excuse me, they said, not bothering to hide their irritation. This is a closed session. If you're not on the participant list. The newcomer didn't answer them. She walked to the end of the table, her steps unhurried, like she had all the time in the world, even with the timer bleeding seconds above her head. 1:21. She stopped beside the woman in the cardigan and dipped her head slightly, making sure her face was within her line of sight. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and gentle. Would you like someone to interpret? She asked. The woman's eyes widened. Relief flickered there, mixed with an old, weary caution. She signed a short response, hands moving with the familiar economy of someone who rarely wasted motion. The newcomer watched her hands, nodding as if listening to spoken words. The chairperson's pen tapped sharply on the table. I need you to step back, they said. We cannot have unauthorized people interfering with proceedings. Only approved interpreters can. The newcomer looked up, finally acknowledging the head of the table. You can verify me, she said, voice still calm. But you don't need my resume to allow basic understanding in the next 60 seconds. Her tone held no heat. That somehow made the words heavier. The chairperson's jaw tightened. Security, they said, glancing toward the glass. Please escort unauthorized participants outside while we clarify credentials. The security supervisor straightened, waiting for things to become explicit. 0:58. The timer ticked down, a digital heartbeat no one questioned. The woman in the cardigan signed again, faster now, hands slicing through the diminishing time. The newcomer's eyes followed every motion with the ease of familiarity. She turned slightly toward the table, toward the people who had been pretending not to watch, and began to interpret in a clear, even voice. She says, the newcomer began. She met with this board in June. At that time, it was agreed that the Foundation's accessibility initiative would not move forward without direct input from those affected. The chairperson lifted a hand. We are not recognizing this interpretation. The newcomer didn't raise her own hand or her voice. She continued, steady. She says, in September, the Foundation took photographs with community members for a public announcement. Those people still haven't received the support they were promised. The room leaned in despite itself. The woman signed another line. The newcomer translated. She says she requested an interpreter for this meeting 2 months ago. She was told the budget couldn't cover it. A murmur rippled along the table. Someone looked pointedly at the branded water bottles, then at the chairperson. 0:34. Stop this. The chairperson snapped, composure cracking at the edges. This is not the appropriate channel. Without formal acknowledgement, these comments are out of order and will not be entered into the record. The billionaire's hand moved. He laid it flat on the table, fingers spread, palm down. The sound of skin meeting polished surface was small, but in the quiet room it echoed more loudly than the chairperson's irritation. Every head turned. He met the chairperson's eyes, holding them in a gaze that was polite on the surface and merciless underneath. Let her finish, he said. The chairperson forced a smile that didn't reach their eyes. We're out of time on this item, they replied. We must adhere to structure if we want to function effectively. I'm sure even you can appreciate. The timer hit midnight and blinked. The billionaire didn't look at it. You're not out of time, he said quietly. You've just run out of excuses. The newcomer's lips twitched, almost a smile, quickly gone. She turned back to the woman in the cardigan. Go on, she said softly. They can hear you now. The humiliation in the room was suddenly, sharply inverted. Later, people would remember small details about the woman in the cardigan. The careful way she closed her folder, the steady way she sat even while the room treated her dignity like something optional. Years earlier, she had sat at smaller tables than this one. Metal breakroom tables, wobbly kitchen tables with chipped edges. Back then, there had been no skyline outside the windows, only parking lots and narrow streets lined with cheap apartments. She had raised her son in those rooms. When he was young, she'd worked nights at a factory that no longer existed, its smokestacks long since torn down to make room for the kind of building she could see now through the glass. Her shifts were long and loud, the world around her a constant blur of lips that didn't bother to face her and instructions barked with impatience. No one offered interpreters there. No policies required it. She'd learned to read gestures and expressions like other people read words. She learned to tell the difference between a mistake and a lie just by the way a person's shoulders moved. Most of all, she learned that the world was eager to confuse deafness with incompetence. When her son was little, she used to sign stories to him at the kitchen table, his small hands trying clumsily to mimic hers. She taught him that power was not the same as character. She signed that money could buy access to rooms like this one, could buy seats at tables and views of skylines and engraved nameplates, but it could never buy respect. Respect had to be given freely and intentionally. She'd watched him grow into those rooms, first on scholarships, then on merit, then on investment deals and bought seats and headlines. She'd watched him accumulate power the way some people accumulate scars. It would have been simple to let him distance himself from where he came from. People in his position often did. But he never stopped signing with her, never stopped reading her notes, asking her what she saw when she looked at the systems he was part of. He invited her to this meeting because the topic wasn't abstract. It wasn't numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about accessibility funding, money pledged to make the places she'd spent her life fighting to navigate a little less hostile to those who came after her. Her presence at the table was not a gift. It was an obligation the board itself had agreed to months ago. The older woman who now stood beside her, the newcomer with the canvas tote, had her own history threaded through rooms like this. Years earlier, she'd worked at a community center in a neighborhood whose name never appeared in glossy brochures. She had been the one parents came to when schools refused to provide interpreters, when hospitals wouldn't print accessible information, when social workers talked around people instead of to them. She'd learned sign language from a neighbor's daughter who'd been sent to a school hours away because no one local would adapt. The girl had been shy at first, hesitant to teach, accustomed to being ignored. The older woman had persisted, hands stumbling through the shapes until they became smoother, more fluent. From there, she'd learned from others, from classes she scraped time and money together to attend, from long evenings practicing with those who'd been overlooked. She knew the particular flavor of dismissal happening in this glass room. She'd seen it in court hearings, in school board meetings, in hospital consults, always wrapped in policy, always delivered with a smile. She hadn't come here expecting to be a savior. She'd been invited as an observer because of her advocacy work years ago. She came to watch, to listen, to see whether this organization meant what it said on its glossy reports. She didn't expect to walk into a familiar scene replaying itself in more expensive clothes. At the table, the woman in the cardigan signed something short and sharp. The newcomer translated, voice steady. She says, "I am not here to be an inspirational prop. I am here because decisions in this room are failing real people." A hush spread across the polished surface like a stain creeping under varnish. The billionaire's gaze swept the room again. The stillness around him now had an edge. It wasn't detachment. It was waiting. Measuring. The chairperson tried to regain control. "This is not the appropriate forum for personal grievances," they said, the word personal landing hard. "We're here to discuss strategic direction, not individual cases." The newcomer didn't roll her eyes. She simply relayed the next line without commentary. She says, "You put real people on your website to sell your strategy. You don't get to call them personal when they ask where the money went." Someone at the table flinched. Outside, the security supervisor shifted his stance, unease written in the set of his shoulders. The junior staffer with the phone no longer pretended to hide what she was doing. Her hands were shaking now, but the camera was steady. The woman in the cardigan signed again, slower this time, her shoulders dropping as if she'd decided to abandon the hope that this could be done comfortably. She says, the newcomer translated, "She isn't asking for pity. She's asking for the baseline respect every other person at this table receives without question." Silence settled, thick and accusing. In that quiet, the billionaire finally moved his chair back an inch, the small scrape of leather and floor sounding like a hinge turning. He placed his hands in front of him, palms down, as if anchoring himself. Then he looked around the room, one face at a time. A senior executive looked away. A consultant tried to maintain a neutral expression and failed. The junior executive who had whispered earlier about arrangements stared down at their notes, face flushing. The billionaire took his time. No one rushed him. "Asked her to be here," he said. "The board agreed to this when we approved the initiative. It's in the minutes. It's in the emails." His eyes flicked toward the folder in front of his mother. "And it's in her notes." The chairperson's smile had completely vanished now. "We're not debating whether she can be here," they said quickly. "We're simply saying it has to be done through proper channels." The billionaire nodded slowly. "Let's talk about channels, then." He turned to the wall display and tapped a control. The timer disappeared, replaced by a small red icon in the corner indicating the meeting was being recorded. "This session is being captured for compliance," he said. "For legal. For audit. Plus whatever our staff and guests are recording on their own." His gaze drifted to the phones that were now half hidden, half brazen on the table. A murmur went through the room. The chairperson's throat bobbed as they swallowed. "The organization has a disability access policy," the billionaire continued. "It requires reasonable accommodations for participants. It requires that meetings under board governance make interpretation available. It forbids treating disability as a barrier to participation when accommodations are possible." He spoke without raising his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of what he said did that on its own. Our governance standards, he went on, require us to ensure that no one is excluded from decision-making because it is inconvenient to include them. Our contracts with our public partners include clauses that obligate us to model accessibility practices we ask others to adopt. He paused. What's happening in this room, he said, is a violation of those standards. The chairperson opened their mouth, desperate now. You're taking this out of context. We were simply asking for clarity, Anne. The newcomer lifted a hand, still gentle. Context is what you get when you listen, she said. You haven't been. The man who had recognized her earlier finally found his voice. She used to interpret in court, he said quietly, addressing no one in particular. 4 years. If you've watched any high-profile accessibility cases in this city, you've seen her. Several heads turned to look at the newcomer with new eyes. The chairperson's face went pale. The newcomer didn't acknowledge the comment. She simply signed back to the woman in the cardigan, a question, an offer. The answer came in a few movements. She says, the newcomer translated, you've spent 20 minutes proving her point. Accessibility here is performative, not real. The billionaire looked at the chairperson. I have a question, he said, and I want you to answer it for the record. The chairperson hesitated, then nodded stiffly. When you thought she couldn't respond, the billionaire asked, his voice soft but cutting, is this how you decided it was acceptable to treat her? Silence. It stretched, long and raw. No one cleared their throat. No one shuffled papers. The only sound was the faint whine of the climate system above. The chairperson's eyes darted around for support that did not arrive. Their fingers trembled on their pen. The woman in the cardigan signed one last line. Hands slow, measured, every motion placed like a stone. She says, the newcomer announced, respect is not a favor. You don't give it when you feel generous and take it back when you're bored or busy. It's the starting point. Everything else builds on that. The billionaire picked up his phone and made a call. He didn't leave the room. He didn't ask permission. He simply tapped a contact and, when the line connected, said, we need you in the boardroom. Now, we have a situation involving accessibility policy violations. He ended the call without waiting for a reply. A few minutes later, the kind of brisk, efficient few minutes that indicated the person on the other end had understood both the urgency and the authority behind the request, the door opened again. A middle-aged person in a dark suit stepped in, a badge clipped to their lapel and a folder under their arm. They looked from the blinking red recording icon to the faces at the table, to the woman in the cardigan and the newcomer at her side. Proceedings are paused, they said. Their tone was neutral, but the room tensed anyway. Effective immediately. All participants, please remain in place while we secure the record. The chairperson found their voice brittle and too fast. Is this really necessary? They asked. We've had a small misunderstanding. There's no need to escalate this into. The compliance officer raised a hand slightly. We've received information that a participant requested accommodations in advance and was denied, they said. We've also been informed that an attempt was made to prevent interpretation during live proceedings and that security was involved in that attempt. All while the subject under discussion was accessibility funding. They let that last phrase hang for a second, cold as a dropped coin. We will be collecting statements, they continued. We will secure copies of all recordings, official and otherwise. The chair of this session is relieved of facilitation duties pending review. The chairperson stared at them, color draining from their face. You're sidelining me based on what? Exactly? A miscommunication. Based on risk, the officer replied. And duty. You'll have the opportunity to provide your perspective. For now, please step away from the head of the table. The movement that followed was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no shouting. But when the chairperson lifted their papers and moved aside, the shift in gravity was unmistakable. The billionaire didn't smirk. He didn't look victorious. He just exhaled, his shoulders lowering, the controlled tension of someone who had waited long enough. As people began to murmur, as the compliance officer spoke quietly with several board members, the junior executive who had sat frozen earlier moved toward the end of the table. They stop a meter away from the woman in the cardigan, clearly unsure whether approaching was welcome. Their voice, when it arrived, was small and halting. "I watched," they said. "From the start. I saw what was happening." They swallowed hard. "And I said nothing because it was easier not to. Because I didn't want to make trouble. Because I thought someone else, someone with more authority, would step in." They met the woman's eyes, then glanced at the newcomer, then back again. "That was cowardly," they said. "Not neutral. Cowardly. I'm sorry. Not just for the room. For myself. I don't want to be the person who sees something and chooses to stay comfortable instead of decent." The woman in the cardigan studied them for a long moment. Then she lifted her hands and signed a brief line. The newcomer smiled faintly and translated. She says, "Don't apologize so you can feel better and move on. Apologize by changing what you do next." The junior executive nodded quickly, eyes shining. "I will," they said. "I'll help draft the new protocols. I'll make sure we never have a meeting like this without interpretation arranged. I'll flag it when people start calling access optional. I'll do the boring work that makes the big promises real." The newcomer laid a light hand on their arm. "Good," she said. "That's where respect lives, in the boring, consistent work." The days that followed were busy in ways that didn't show up in glossy reports but mattered much more. The governance committee opened a formal inquiry. HR scheduled interviews. External counsel reviewed policies and their implementation. Staff were asked, individually and in groups, what they had witnessed, what they had assumed, what they had allowed to pass unchecked. The chairperson was formally suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Not fired in a blaze of public drama, just removed from power with quiet, deliberate finality while the facts were sorted. The organization issued a statement that, unusually for such things, did not rely on vague phrasing. It acknowledged failures to provide required accommodations and to uphold the dignity of a participant and outlined specific steps being taken. An accessibility audit was commissioned with a firm that actually specialized in such things, not just in appearances. Interpreter access was written into governing documents as a non-negotiable requirement rather than a courtesy. Live captioning was mandated for all board-level meetings. Meeting request forms were redesigned to ask, clearly and upfront, about access needs. The woman in the cardigan was invited to join a working group, not as a decorative representative but as someone whose lived experience was treated as expertise. She accepted, on the condition that the group included others like her, people who had spent more time surviving institutions than designing them. The older woman with the canvas tote was asked to consult. She set clear boundaries and insisted on certain conditions. No tokenism, no one-off sessions, no using her presence as a shield against criticism. She agreed to help structure training for facilitators, to review policy drafts, to be in the room when decisions were made. The junior executive who had confessed their silence kept their promise. They became the annoying person in emails who asked, "Have we scheduled interpreters?" They checked room layouts against accessibility guidelines. They pushed back when someone suggested captioning was too expensive for internal meetings. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't make headlines. It was the work that changed what happened in the room. Weeks later, another session convened in the same glass-walled space. The table was the same. The skyline beyond the glass was the same, though the light hit it at a slightly different angle. The branded water bottles were the same, perhaps a different flavor, but still lined up precisely. There were differences, though. Two interpreters sat near the center of the table, each with a clear view of those who needed them. Small microphones stood closer to speakers, ensuring audio feeds were clean for captioning. The wall display, before any agenda items appeared, showed a brief slide. Accessibility check, confirmed. Interpreters, captions, materials. The compliance officer sat at one side, watching without hovering. The woman in the gray cardigan sat near the middle of the table now, not at the far end. Her folder lay open, her worn pen resting across it. The faded photograph was still tucked into one sleeve of paper, edges softer now from being handled. She looked the same. Her cardigan hadn't changed. Her hair was still pinned back neatly. Her hands still rested calmly on her notes. The room around her, however, carried a new kind of tension, not the brittle, defensive kind from before, but the alertness of people trying not to repeat a mistake. When the meeting began, the acting chair opened not with numbers, but with a statement. "We start," they said, "by ensuring everyone can participate fully. That is not an extra. It is the condition for everything else." It was a small sentence. It marked a large shift. Later in the session, the woman in the cardigan raised her hands. One of the interpreters mirrored her position at the front of the room. She signed, unhurried. The interpreter voiced her words clearly into the microphone. "I did not change between our last meeting and this one." Her words came through the speakers. "The only thing that changed is how seriously you take your own promises." A few people shifted in their seats. "You're not doing me a favor," she signed. "You're doing what you said you'd do." The billionaire watched her. His expression softened now, though the same attentiveness remained. His power had not diminished in the least, but the way he held it felt different, less like a shield around himself, more like a lever he could place where it mattered. The older woman with the canvas tote sat at the side of the room, scribbling notes in a small notebook, occasionally looking up to nod at something done well or frown at something that still needed work. She did not try to own the moment. She simply monitored it, ready to nudge when necessary. During a break, the junior executive refilled coffee and water, not because it was their job, but because they were there in hands when needed. When they moved past the woman in the cardigan, they paused. "Thank you," they said quietly, "for not letting us pretend we're better than we act." The woman smiled faintly. She signed a brief phrase. The interpreter nearby, off duty for the moment but listening, supplied the translation gently. She says, "Thank you for choosing not to be who you were the last time." As people filtered back in, as laptops reopened and pages turned, the woman in the cardigan touched the faded photo tucked among her notes. It showed her, younger, sitting at a small kitchen table with a boy perched on a chair too big for him, his hands mid-motion as he tried to copy hairs. They were both laughing in the frozen moment. Back then, she'd hoped he wouldn't have to fight as hard as she had. Now, watching him at this table, quiet, powerful, using that power to make rooms bend toward respect, she understood something else. He could never remove himself from the system entirely, but he could decide what kind of man he would be inside it. And the room could decide what kind of place it was going to be going forward. Near the end of the meeting, the acting chair invited her to address the group directly. She signed, and the interpreter spoke. "Assumptions are lazy," she said. "They are also dangerous." She let that settle before continuing. "When you assume someone who doesn't speak like you, look like you, move like you is confused or less capable, it isn't just rude. It shapes what you allow yourself to do to them, what you think you can get away with." She looked around the room, meeting eyes with quiet steadiness. Respect shouldn't depend on a person's net worth, or their title, or whether their voice works the way yours does, or whether they are easy for you to understand. Respect is something you decide to give or decide to withhold. Her hands move more slowly now, the weight of each word deliberate. And courage, she signed, doesn't always look like big speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it looks like a person at a table saying, "This isn't right," before someone else is forced to. She finished, and the interpreter's voice faded. There was no applause. That wasn't the kind of room this was. But the silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It felt like listening. Later, the video snippets from the disastrous first meeting would circulate online. People would argue in comment sections about whether the chairperson had meant harm, whether the billionaire had used his power correctly, whether the consequences had gone far enough. The part that mattered most would not make as many headlines. It would sit here, in this quietly changed room, in the redesigned forms, in the nervous glances at accessibility checklists, in the junior staffer who now automatically booked interpreters without being reminded, in the older woman who kept turning up when policy drafts were reviewed, insisting that every line be measured not against convenience but against impact, in the billionaire who kept asking, before voting on any initiative, who isn't in this room that should be, and what are we doing to fix that? And in the woman in the cardigan, who knew, from a lifetime of experience, that institutions rarely change because of one dramatic incident alone. They changed when enough people inside them decided that silence was no longer an option they could live with. Outside, the city moved on. Traffic and construction and meetings in other glass rooms where other decisions were being made. Inside this particular one, as the session adjourned and people gathered their devices and notes, a question lingered over the polished table like a reflection that refused to disappear. The next time you see someone being dismissed, not heard because of how they communicate, where they come from, how old they are, how they look, will you look away and call it not your place? Or will you be the person who steps closer, who says, in whatever way you can, I see you, I hear you, you belong in this room, and I will not pretend you don't.